nobody would question that. Nobody would question that rule of law has not improved. If anything, it has become probably worse. However, over the last 4 years, Mexico has reduced poverty quite significantly. Mexico took out of poverty 5 million people, which is more people than in the last 2 decades. Our reduction in poverty has been probably the most important one of the century. And also, we have observed a reduction in inequality. The reduction in inequality is not only from the last 4 years, it's something that we have observed over the last 2 decades. So could you, walk us through what Mexico did to improve the conditions of people, even if there is this huge problem of rule of law?
Well, first, I will introduce a word of caution on what you said. Poverty had been reduced consistently in the early years of the century. So it is not true that what happens now, and I hope this is sustained, was happening before. And this is serious academic work that has been done. I think you are making reference to the recent Coneval studies. And I think it's good to look not only at the rate of poverty, which after all is the result of dividing two numbers, but also at the components of how the index is being done. And I have great respect for the work of Coneval. Fortunately, it's one of the few institutions that has been sort of respected by the current executive. But I think you have to answer two questions. One is what are the factors that are driving that improvement in the ratio of poverty? And you have to question whether those factors will be sustainable, permanent. And then I think some questions will emerge there with policy consequences. I hear some of my friends saying, yes, that's very significantly explained by the increase of income that families have had because of remittances from the US. And the question is whether we want to depend on remittances to reduce poverty in Mexico. Also, and this is very sad, you have to wonder whether the fact that the pandemic affected the most poor people in Mexico will lead you to a lower ratio of poverty, because the poor have death. The deaths are overrepresented by the poor people in Mexico. Now, this question, unfortunately, is supported by one of the figures provided in Coneval. And that is, they have a sub-index that shows that access to health services by the poor have collapsed in Mexico, right? So again, that will introduce a word of caution. I will say, don't be triumphalistic about that. I wish it were a permanent feature. I wish I could relate it straightforwardly to policy actions, but I don't think, because I haven't done serious work about that. So I will warn you to be careful about, unfortunately, schools in Mexico are having troubles. Our best school in social sciences, CIDED, which is a a public school, is now literally under a condition of destruction, of attack from the part of the government. So maybe we will have no researchers in Mexico left to inquire what is really happening. I hope some remain, and if not, in other academic centers, they look at this question.
I've been looking at that question in my own research in Mexico, and I would say that there are three main components of the reduction in poverty. One is indeed the one you mentioned about remittances. In my own account, that takes in consideration about 8% of the reduction. Then you have social programs, particularly cash transfers that have increased with this government, actually have doubled with this government. It's a very controversial policy because even if social programs have doubled, the total amount of spending is not very different from 2018 or from 2016 or 2017. So there has been a shift basically from providing services to providing cash, and that has improved the income that people own, so that reflects on the measures of poverty. But the most important one of the components is income, and is how salaries have increased. The minimum wage from 1977 in Mexico to 2014 diminished in 75%, to the point that in 2014 it was impossible to buy the basic basket of consumption for a full-time worker in Mexico. Now, over the last few years, the minimum wage has doubled, and it seems that that has been one of the main and most important drivers of the reduction in poverty. So my question would be, going into income, particularly labor income, what do you think Mexico can do to improve income of their workers, knowing that, and I want to caveat this because this is an important academic debate, knowing that productivity of workers has increased from 1994 to today. It hasn't increased in the last 10 years, but it has increased since the 90s. So why do you think the worker has been incapable of capturing the increases in productivity that has happened in the Mexican economy?
Well, first, again, Viri, and I hate to, let's say, to try to teach to a Harvard person, because I'm a Yale. But I will curb your enthusiasm about making reference to the minimum wage. I think it's great if they were increased. It's great. Except, I will say it's true, but probably not so relevant, because we have almost 60% of our active labor force working in the informal sector of the economy. The minimum wage is relevant for the formal sector of the economy. Not so relevant because actually effective wages are a multiple, is a reference for the compensation that workers receive in the formal sector of the economy. But the problem is that we have almost 60% of our labor force employed in the informal sector, where people have very precarious social security, where the law is not enforced, where people usually don't pay income taxes, and so on, all the other characteristics. So I would be extremely careful about boasting about the minimum wage, the legal minimum wage, as a driver. I think more importantly, you have to think about productivity. And the reason why overall labor productivity or total factor productivity has performed so badly in Mexico and in other Latin American countries too, has to do with the segmentation that we have in the labor market. And what I was telling in my initial remarks, at least implicitly, is that we have to deal with that market segmentation. I think we have to look at the underlying conditions that cause that segmentation and that causes this macroeconomic result of very low labor and total factor productivity. And my suggestion, and it is not me who has elaborated that, it's more that of Santiago Levy, you know, the guy who helped me to do the Progresa program, the conditional cash transfers program, which was the first in the world, and which, by the way, helps a lot to explain the reduction of poverty in the early years of the century in Mexico, and had no clientelism objectives, and that has been well studied at your university and also at MIT and others. Well, what Santiago has said is, you know, we simply have to evolve into universal social security with all its implications. It should not be making any difference whether you are a worker in a small enterprise or you are a worker in General Motors. We should have universal social security, and you should have portability of your benefits between jobs. And that, I think, will be the way to have a more efficient use of our most important resource, which is human capital. But that, of course, entails very significant reforms that will encounter significant political difficulties. I was suggesting, however, that it is possible to think about big bargains in which the social contract could be established in those terms.